Thank you for joining us today. We will be providing simultaneous interpretation for this webinar. To utilize this feature, please click on the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen, click Interpretation, and then click English or French. Nous vous remercions de vous joindre à nous pour le webinaire ce matin. L'interprétation simultanée est disponible pendant ce webinaire. Pour utiliser la fonction d'interprétation, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton d'interprétation en bas de votre écran. Cliquez sur Interprétation, puis sur Anglais ou Français. Good morning. I'm Tyler McCann, Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. I'd like to begin the webinar with an acknowledgement of the First Nations across Canada whose land we are on. I'm joining you from Calgary, the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. The relationship between First Nations peoples and animals across Canada goes back centuries and should be considered as we think about animal agriculture today in Canada and in the future. CAPI's work is only possible due to the support of funders. Today's webinar and the broader Animal Agriculture White Paper Project has been supported by partners through our CAPI Partnership Program. We would really like to express our sincere thanks and appreciation for the financial support from the Grand River Agriculture Society, UFA Cooperative, Dairy Farmers of Canada, the Canadian Cattle Association, and the Livestock Research and Innovation Corporation. Additionally, CAPI collaborated broadly with industry and sector experts through a steering committee and consultations throughout the white paper process. I thank those who participated for sharing their time and expertise. The support from CAPI partners is essential to the future of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. In the past, CAPI was able to almost exclusively rely on funding from governments, but now we appreciate, value, and need support from diversified sources. If you have a project that aligns with and would benefit from CAPI's approach, an approach focused on advancing policy solutions that meet the growing needs of consumers in Canada and around the world through a more resilient, sustainable, productive, competitive, and profitable agri-food system, please get in touch. We welcome the opportunity to connect with you to explore how a partnership with CAPI can benefit your organization and advance Canadian agriculture and food. Canada's animal agriculture sectors should be thriving. Our country has the natural resource, land, and water base. We have efficient animal care practices, genetics, ways of growing animal feed, and more. We have the ability to produce the protein the world is demanding with lower carbon emissions than many other countries. Yet our livestock sector faces challenges, including what can be at times a challenging policy environment. CAPI undertook this extensive white paper process to empower policymakers to understand the fundamental strategic components of the livestock sector in a more holistic way. The result is a white paper which delves into existing literature and data, weaves through interpretations and insights, eventually arriving at a SWOT analysis which identifies strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It balances the intricate details of original research with a strategic analysis to guide the future of animal agriculture policy decisions. The white paper resulted in a synthesis report that has been released. Today, Al Mussel, CAPI's Director of Research and lead on this project, will share his perspectives about the process and the key findings and recommendations from the report. In addition to his role with CAPI, Al is the research lead and founder of Agri-Food Economic Systems. His areas of research expertise are farm management, agriculture marketing, and agriculture policy. Over to you, Al.
Thanks very much, Tyler. I just need to share my screen here. Apparently that needs to be enabled. All right. Okay, thanks, Tyler. I'd like to kick this off by providing a little bit of an overview of our white paper project and the work leading up to the synthesis document. And I'd like to start with kind of our framework for assessment. And this was taken from. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting my slide. This was taken from the.
If you click on that too.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yeah, now it's great. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. This framework was taken from the UN Economics of Ecology and Biodiversity project and adapted for this purpose. And the way it helps us is it provides us with the scope of our inquiry as we try and assess animal agriculture in Canada, and also put guardrails around that scope. And the other thing that we liked about it very much was it has something of a balance sheet type of a framework where you have sort of a starting inventory of capital stocks of the various forms across the bottom of the slide. You've got the flows that are generated from those capital stocks, and then you have the ending inventory of the capital stocks after flows have been taken out of it. So that was very appealing from a dynamic perspective. So really the job in this project was to populate this framework with data, do some analysis around that data, and then generate observations and findings. And I'm going to hit on some of the high points of those in this presentation. So some of the observations. First of all, animal agriculture is very important. Canada is pretty good at it. Animal foods are healthy in diets and actually very important globally. We've made impressive improvements in productivity in animal agriculture, but there's lots of remaining challenges that we need to engage. Trends in global demand are somewhat out of sync with where we're at today with Canadian capacity. And Canada is a low-intensity greenhouse gas producer. So let me take a few minutes to go and develop those points. Canadian animal agriculture is very important in Canada. Now, money and economic impact isn't the only way to look at this. It's very important socially in terms of how people work together in institutions to manage the complexities of animal agriculture. It's also very important environmentally. But economic impact is one of the ways that we measure this. And as you can see, animal agriculture has very material economic impact. And this is, I think, particularly important because a lot of it occurs in rural areas that otherwise wouldn't be able to manage this level of economic impact through some other industry. Animal agriculture is the linkage between human food and the broadest sort of cross section of land uses, and there's a lot of complexity that's sort of reflected in this little chart, and I think also perhaps a little bit of a danger that I'm going to come back to a couple of times. For example, there is a tendency for some to just connect the arrow, for example, from crops or crop residues directly to the animal, and ask, well, how much crop does it take to make the animal? Which is maybe the simplest definition of feed conversion ratio. And of course, we have data on that compiled in our white paper. It's very good information, and you can see feed conversion ratios vary across species. So some people will look at information like this and come to a conclusion with regard to comparative efficiency of different species. However, there are other dimensions to look at, and one of those has to do with the use of inedible products, inedible from a human perspective, in livestock feeds. And you can see from this chart, which is a global chart, a very high proportion of what feeds farm animals are inedible products. And of course, that fragments itself very differently across species, with some bias, I would say, in favor of ruminants as well as small ruminants. So it's not a single parameter type of an efficiency metric. When we go and look globally, this is some information here from FAO modeling work. Canada is lumped in with the United States under North America in this rubric. You can see if we look at feed efficiency measurements, Canada and the United States are among the most efficient animal agriculture producers that we have across a broad range of production conditions. And this happens to be for beef and dairy. It's not a lot different for swine or poultry. We've had impressive improvements in productivity over time. I look particularly at the chicken example of a single genetic strain fed out across 56 days, and how that looked in a 2000 in a study looking at 2005 data compared with 1978, and elsewhere, milk production per cow, rate of gain in beef, and there are other markers around breeding efficiency, farrowing rate, feed efficiency in swine, etc. Canada has comparatively low-priced feed grains, and this chart here happens to illustrate corn and barley, two of our main feed grains. And Canada generally most years has, with barley, probably the lowest or among the lowest, and usually corn close to the United States, but comparatively less expensive than other jurisdictions. This is very important because economically, livestock moves to feed, not the other way around. That the other way around does not work economically. So based on that, when we choose to compete internationally, Canada is generally competitive. This is some information. This happens to be on pig cost of production, a recent study done in the UK comparing a range of European countries with Canada. And again, going from a relatively low-cost feed grain basis, Canada's comparatively low cost with a range of European countries. If we had the US in here, I believe that Canada and the US would look very, very similar. And most other countries, major producers, would not look as low as either Canada or the US. Animal proteins are very important in diets globally. Proteins are available from a range of sources. There are plant proteins as well as animal proteins, but one of the key differences between animal proteins and plant proteins is digestibility. The left-hand panel of this graph is looking at gross proteins, and the countries below the red line. The red line is a daily requirement. Those that are under deficiency. But if we go and look and we score in the right-hand panel the digestibility, particularly with respect to lysine in that protein, there are far more countries that are deficient. And without animal proteins, it would be exceptionally difficult or probably impossible to bring these countries up to those dietary requirements. More recently, we have a study I just actually have seen within the last week from the UN FAO discussing the significance of animal foods, animal-based foods in diets globally, and highlighting issues around children's nutrition, women's nutrition, obesity, and diet-related non-communicable diseases. A very important aspect of health. Canada is a low emissions greenhouse gas emissions intensity producer. Now this chart here sort of illustrates this for beef, pork, and chicken. What we've done here is we've got the blue kind of globe representation here, which comes from the FAO GLEAM model, which is an ag emissions model. And what we've done, we've converted results of a number of different Canadian studies to be comparable with these GLEAM measures. And you can see Canada's well below in some cases, or below in all cases, the global average of these emissions. So there's a lot that we can celebrate, but boy, there's some sobering challenges. We're continually pushed to produce more food without land conversion. We have workforce challenges. We have to worry about climate change and extreme weather, menacing diseases like African swine fever, managing animal welfare and biological systems overload, the pressure of disease and having appropriate treatments and interventions to deal with disease pressures, the erosion of rules-based international trade, and managing our social capital base. Let me say something about each of these. This is a chart that comes from my economist colleague Carl Zulauf at Ohio State University, and the point that this chart makes is there's two different ways to increase output of feed grains. One is to increase yields. The other is to increase bring more acreage into production. And what this chart is telling us is that prior to about the year 2000, globally with feed grains, yield increases were capable of supplying the growth in demand. Since 2000, essentially it hasn't been, and we've had to bring in more and more land. Well, animal agriculture fits on top of that as the converter. And the more efficiently that we can convert those feed grains into human food products, the less land we will need to bring into production. And this is, from a sustainability perspective, quite critical. The workforce gap in Canada, I think, is probably pretty well known. These are the results of a survey done by the Canadian Ag Human Resource Council, survey findings from animal agriculture specifically. And if you think of a workforce gap in agriculture as being largely in horticulture, it's very important in horticulture, but it's also very important in animal agriculture. Pasture land in Canada has been in decline. The left-hand panel here is the red areas represent a significant decline between 2011 and 2021, and you can see the decline in both natural pasture land in particular, but also seeded or managed pasture land on the right-hand panel. This is important because it's both sustained economically by grazing animals, but also conversely, to the extent that it's converted to other uses, it leaves less space and economic room for grazing animals. Biodiversity is an ongoing challenge. One way to measure that, there are others, but is the bird index, and certainly not all of this relates to agriculture or animal agriculture, but certainly some of it does. And for all that we've had some success improving the situation for your birds of prey and waterfowl, grassland birds, and based on the last study that's been done, continue to be in decline as well as others. How we manage extreme or cope with extreme weather and climate change in animal agriculture is important. A study done for the Ontario government recently drew on the literature to investigate the anticipated effects of prolonged heat waves. And you can see when you have a spell of over 32 degrees Celsius in dairy cattle, they found it significantly reduces feed intake, significantly reduces milk production, leads to reproductive problems, and this can carry over for a long period of time. They looked at other animals as well. I've only looked at dairy here, but with similar findings. We anticipate that there's going to be greater incidence of droughts, floods, and hail, but this becomes very complicated. The literature tells us that to some degree, at least, an increased concentration of atmospheric CO2 can actually increase yields of many crops, particularly the C3 crops, not the C4 crops. However, the literature also tells us we should anticipate that the nutrient content of these crops will decline with, as far as I know, uncertain impacts on nutrition for people, for animals, but also the viability of seed. So this is a very, very concerning situation. One of the challenges that we have with, whether it's genetic improvement, nutrition, handling, et cetera, is managing an excessive focus on productivity traits of the animal as opposed to the functions of the animal itself. So this is a chart that comes from some work done at Michigan State University a number of years ago, plotting milk production per cow relative to the daughter pregnancy rate in dairy cows. And as you can see, as we focused more and more on milk production traits in nutrition and husbandry, et cetera, conception has been more and more of a problem. We have menacing diseases. We have other production limiting diseases. We need products to be able to engage that. And we want those products to have as little overlap as possible with human pharmaceuticals, and this is an ongoing challenge. We also need a system that will bring innovation in those products into the system. Some findings from a recent 2020 benchmarking study looking at Canada's regulatory system for animal health products and concerns about modernization of that system, harmonization with other jurisdictions, and the costs of registering new products in Canada relative to the size of the market, what that means for the willingness to introduce new technologies. The global meat industry and animal protein in general is growing. It's expected to grow by 29% by 2050. That compares with 2011, and a population of 10 billion people. And you can see the most recent projections from the OECD. Meanwhile, our cow herd in Canada has been stagnant and expected to decline further, as has been the sow herd. And again, it is expected to decline further. So we're out of sync. We have the natural resources. We should have the capacity, but we're out of sync with those international trends in terms of demand. Part of that is some concern about the erosion of rules-based trade. I'll let you read the quote here, which is a little bit troubling, from the WTO Director General. But essentially, what it is saying is, on our export-oriented industries, we need security of market access to be able to gear up with our investments. On our domestically oriented industries, we need a discipline around imports to allow them to function. And increasingly, we have to worry about the integrity of those systems. So where does this leave us? Well, in my understanding of it, the world has a food security problem. It particularly relates to protein. At the same time, we have a climate change and biodiversity set of problems. There's a small number of countries in the world that have capacity, material capacity, to supply others efficiently and sustainably with animal food products. And Canada is one of them. But we're having trouble rationalizing our capacity and working within that sphere. How can governments help in policy? Well, we can explore measures that help us prevent the conversion of grasslands and support the grazing sector and hold that land use in place. These are long-term considerations. On the swine side, African swine fever is an existential threat, and I think that needs to be really thoroughly appreciated for a country so leveraged to export as Canada. We have public action there already. One place that it particularly lags is the problem of wild pigs as a vessel for infection, and the need to harmonize action across provinces and the federal government. The rules-based trade system has eroded. Canada's already been working on this heavily. However, more needs to be done, and part of that is enforcement of existing trade relations that we have today. Climate change and food security need to be on par with one another. Canada has the platform and the interest to provide a type of a filter that equates food security with climate change policy. Because we have an efficient and relatively low emissions intense animal agriculture, downsizing or otherwise impairing the efficiency of Canadian animal agriculture with emissions constraints presents a bit of a contradiction between food security and climate change. Conversion efficiency is a core focus that extends across species in animal agriculture, and this is really the core finding of our work, I think. We need to be able to support industry cooperation that will build social capital that helps support the institutions that manage the complexities of animal agriculture. We need more work on industry competitiveness in Canada. We've mentioned regulatory modernization, research, infrastructure, data capture, and sharing, and other aspects as well. We need to pay real attention to biological systems overload and how far we can go with pushing animals to be productive without influencing welfare characteristics. And finally, a balanced scorecard is needed through which we can assess animal agriculture. We can't take single parameters like feed conversion ratio, as illustrated earlier, and apply that as an assessment to animal agriculture. And I'll conclude there.
Thank you very much, Al, for that overview of the paper. We'll bring you back into the discussion shortly, but first we're going to go to our panelists. I'll ask them all a question and rotate through them all, and then get into a group discussion after. For those that are watching on the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit questions. We'd be happy to get to them throughout the discussion today. So our first panelist that we'll introduce is Dr. Robin White. Robin earned a BS, Bachelor of Science, and a PhD degrees from the Department of Animal Sciences at Washington State University. She then completed postdoctoral fellowships with the National Animal Nutrition Program and as an AFRI-ELI postdoctoral fellow. Dr. White is currently an Associate Professor of Animal Systems Management and Associate Director of the Center for Advanced Innovation in Agriculture at Virginia Tech. Our team focuses on improving understanding of ruminant nutrition and leveraging nutrition and technology as strategies to enhance sustainability by exploring basic mechanisms governing rumen fermentation, applying models and technologies to enhance feed efficiency, and characterizing strategies to enhance food system sustainability. Dr. White, your research has looked at the role animal agriculture plays in food system sustainability. I was wondering if you could start by talking about how that research is evolving and what we know from your work, the work of others, about the role of animal agriculture on broader food system sustainability.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Tyler. I'm pleased to share some of our high-level findings. First off, our early work really highlighted the fact that the narrative that at least I grew up with as an animal scientist, that we're really in the business of producing protein, is a dramatic oversimplification of the role of animals in our food systems. Animal agriculture is critical for producing digestible amino acids, as we've heard from the introductory materials here. But in terms of the sheer numbers in our food system, it's perhaps more important as a role for some of our essential micronutrients, including vitamins, minerals, and essential fatty acids, some of which cannot be found in non-animal source foods. So nutritionally, that tends to be, at least what our data would suggest, is one of the more critical elements of animal source foods in sustainable diets. From a broader standpoint, animal source foods also provide really nutritiously dense sources of those nutrients. And what we mean by that is that the ratio of a nutrient to the energy content of the food is quite high, which means that you can meet your nutrient requirement without exceeding an energy requirement. That helps address some of the challenges with overnutrition that occur in many regions around the world, preventing micronutrient deficiencies with an overweight phenotype, which is increasingly common. In terms of the ruminant animals in particular, they present a major challenge within our food production systems because they cause this conflicting priority, right? Ruminant animals have this incredible, unique opportunity to participate in circular agricultural systems because their rumen allows them to recycle human inedible materials. And our work would suggest that that's a unique niche that is important in our food systems. However, it's that specific activity, that organ, that rumen, that's able to enable the animal to participate in circular food systems that also contributes notably to greenhouse gases. And so finding strategies to address those emissions is a major priority for our industries so that we can reduce the compromise there. We can enable the participation of ruminants in food production systems while minimizing negative environmental impacts.
I think that concept of circular food systems is something that like the traditional agriculture community has maybe had a hard time understanding or thinking about. I don't think it's something that we often consider, but when you think about that upcycling, that value added in taking food waste and converting it into protein, what does that opportunity look like, or do we have a really good, I guess, understanding of what that potential means and what it can hold for animal agriculture?
Yeah, I think that animal agriculture has been participating in circular food systems. And so it's not a new practice, though we use different words to describe it. I think that's common of human nature. We kind of invent a new term and get excited about it when really we've been feeding animals human inedible materials for quite some time, simply because it's economically efficient to do so. The value of this is that it allows us to capture those nutrients. And in many ways, what we're doing is investing energy. A lot of these materials that we feed to livestock are high in carbohydrates, oftentimes fibers, and that's energy that humans are largely unable to utilize. But we can invest that energy in the biomass and concentrate it through animal agricultural systems into these nutrient-dense sources of digestible amino acids, essential vitamins, minerals, and fatty acids. So that's kind of the high-level opportunity there. we do need to view that in the context of a number of challenges. That value of recouping potentially underutilized or unutilized energy and resources within the biosphere comes with some trade-offs. Again, notably the environmental impact associated with that conversion process. So finding ways to mitigate that trade-off is an important objective that we need to view as we consider optimizing the role of livestock in these circular food systems.
And do we have a good system of urban accounting? Does our math, the equations that we do when we look at the environmental impact, do they really understand that trade-off that you just talked about?
That's an interesting question. We have a number of different strategies that are used to characterize environmental impacts of food systems and of foods. And depending on the methodology used, you can have somewhat divergent conclusions about animal agriculture and the environmental impacts of animal agriculture. We have kind of top-down approaches, which look at global or country level emissions accounting and attempt to explore the sources and sinks of different emissions. Those are the different technology or methods which result in statistics like, the animal agriculture contributing 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, right? That's where those numbers come from. We also have methods to calculate the footprints of individual products. So we might do a life cycle assessment on an industry or on an individual product, that value chain, and estimate the carbon footprint of that particular product. So, a statistic like the US or Canadian carbon footprint of beef might be something like 18 kilos of CO2 equivalents per kilo would be obtained through those types of methodologies. The first, that kind of top-down accounting is capturing emissions from different sectors, but doing so at a very high level. And so it can be challenging to understand things like the trade-offs and counterbalances associated with circular food systems. When we get into carbon footprints, we also run into this challenge of allocation and how we do the bean counting, right? Who gets assigned what emissions? And that is an imperfect process.
Great. Well, and we'll dive into that later. Thank you, Dr. White, for kicking this off. We'll go to our second panelist now. Graham Gilchrist is a professional agrologist with over 30 years of experience serving the needs of rural Western Canada. He's the principal of Gilchrist Consulting, and he does a few things well. He advises farms and rural businesses on management and governance. He also assists with the farm side of oil and gas development and land access. As a licensed investigator, he assists both farms and their legal advisors in building cases. He also advises rural organizations that need a little help with governance. Graham serves as the CEO of the nonprofit society Biological Carbon Canada, specializing in greenhouse gas markets for Canadian farms. Graham is also proud to serve as an independent director for the Alberta Federation of Agriculture. He spent 25 years with the Alberta Civil Service and rose to serve Albertans as the province's assistant farmers advocate and assistant property rights advocate. Graham also spent 5 years as an administrative judge with the Municipal Government Board. He holds a license to practice agrology in Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, and is a registered investigator for Alberta. Graham, you've looked at farm business planning and strategy. It's been a lot of your days now working on carbon. I think there's this interesting call to better integrate animal agriculture into cropping systems. We hear this as one of the original principles of regenerative agriculture, but those stats would point to the fact that we're seeing less of that, not more. I'm curious, when you think about kind of that farm business planning, that experience over the years, what do you see as the future of the mixed farms or integration of animal ag and cropping systems?
Those mixed farms have a challenge, Tyler. We have production systems that are, if we talk about non-supply management, we have production systems that are driving to the bottom line. We have efficiency challenges to get the most out of our systems. You've got a revenue challenge, depending on which way the price goes. Prices, your costs of goods sold aren't going up, or I should say are going up. And so every dollar you're trying to squeeze out of that system tends to mean you've got to get really good at something you'd do very well, and it becomes location dependent. What you can do the far side of the Duke versus the far side of Manyberries versus the far side of Niagara Falls really drives what that production system does at its best. The folks that want to continue mixed farms are dealing with just then more than one challenge. If you've got a change in your canola enterprise versus your change in your small beef enterprise, or you're trying to put sheep underneath orchards, each one of those have their systems. So if you are trying to drive to the bottom line to squeeze as much deep out of your revenue, then other parts shouldn't drag that. And so the challenge of mixed farms is to figure out how to do that well, least cost, and at the end of the day, make sure you've got money in your pocket to engage your family.
And when you think about money in your pocket, going back to the kind of the sustainability carbon theme, what do you see as the future or the likelihood that more farmers and animal agriculture are going to end up with more money in their pocket because of the ecological services that they provide?
That is more than 8 years out, Tyler. Yes, we have government transfers, kickstarting various initiatives, to deal with that. We do have a price on carbon. Agriculture, for all intents and purposes, is an exempt emitter, and yet the governance of the market, or your ability to put a product into the market, is very slow to come. There are a few protocols in the Alberta market that you can engage. There's a fed cattle one here, but from a backstop set of provinces, we don't have those protocols up and running yet. And once we leave the regulated market, we can go into insetting, we go into data management sales. Those markets are currently all bilateral. And it takes time, effort, and money for that farm to put the data together in the right framework that somebody is then willing to buy from you. Yes, we like to talk about the $65 a ton levy here in Canada, but when we look at the dollars coming out of the CME and what our volunteer carbon look at, we're talking about $1.25 per ton. So your output is very challenging of getting enough into the market, and then your price is not all that attractive.
And what do you think that the future will be, or around protocols for emissions avoidance, right? So if you look at protocols or payments around farmers using feed additives or making some of these productivity enhancements, how do you think that that's going to compare in that ag carbon landscape to protocols for carbon sequestration, which I think is often where people first think about the potential for carbon?
Good question. Protocols are expensive to start with. Some of the work we saw in Alberta, they're about $1 million a pop, about $350,000, $400,000 to put the science together to draft the protocols. You've got to get it approved. And then best practice tells us we need another $500,000 to see whether or not the industry has the evidence that you just laid out on the protocol. And to date, those have all been challenging, whether or not it's the original dairy protocol or the current one right now with the avoided conversions of grasslands in the voluntary sector. The protocol lays out what you need, and then that project has to go into that farm and ranch and find the evidence, document it, and then put it and ultimately get it onto the registry to give you a serial number. That's just one part. We have other pricing systems that are trying to package up data. So even though you may have this next feed additive that you can change the enteric fermentation of an animal, you may not participate in that. If you're a cow-calf owner, the fed animal protocol is dealing with the feedlot industry, and currently there's no mechanism. Well, as you sell the animal, do you keep the rights? We have large feedlots in the U.S. that have gone to feeding their additive that's not licensed here in Canada. So there's some challenges that way as well.
Great. Thank you, Graham. So we'll pick some of those challenges back up in our group discussion after. Next, I'll bring Brenna Grant into the discussion. Brenna is the executive director of CanFax and has been with the organization since 2007. She grew up in southwestern Saskatchewan on a cow-calf yearling grasser operation that her family still operates. Brenna received a BA in agricultural economics from the University of Saskatchewan and a master's in applied economics from Montana State University. Brenda, I want to dive into those economics and markets with you. I think Al touched on this earlier, but the report highlights that a lot of the global fundamentals for beef and pork in particular are heading in theoretically that right direction. We've got demand up, supply is tightening around the world, but Canada seems to be struggling to capitalize on those positive fundamentals. How do you see the economics and markets future of animal agriculture in Canada?
One of the things we need to remember with a commodity like beef is it's highly impacted by weather. And so whether it's been the drought in North America and even South America recently, but even Australia this summer went into drought. And that's been a major limitation for beef around the world that relies on grasslands, extensive grasslands for production. And even if there is a positive price signal in the marketplace, you're not going to see expansion until you have feed supplies readily available. One of the big questions as we're sitting at record high prices for cattle right now in 2023 is the question of ongoing consumer resilience and demand. And we have seen food price inflation here in North America, and lots of other countries have also experienced inflation. But we need to remember that that's not everywhere. And a number of Asian countries, Japan as an example, has actually had retail beef prices that have been steady for the last 5 years. And so this really means that we have a lot of different prices in the global marketplace right now in terms of those who have been experiencing higher prices and those that have really been stagnant in those prices. And the expectation going into next year is that we're going to need to see some global price arbitrage. We're going to have larger supplies coming out of Australia and Brazil due to liquidation caused by weather, and that has reduced their prices significantly in the last several months. And so we're going to see these dynamics at play in terms of price arbitrage, but also as we see what the global consumer is willing to pay for different products.
And what signal? I think often we wait for that signal for the growth to happen to kick in. And do you think that global price arbitrage, you again, you go back to the weather pressures that farmers are facing? Do you expect that to mean to point to kind of that growth curve heading in the different direction than it has? Is that still years away as the dust settles on all of these different factors?
So we've been growing global beef production in response to higher prices over the last 25 years. We have 6 million tons more beef today than we had in 2000. We've also seen growth in pork and poultry. As we have a growing global population, there is just a demand for protein in general. The pie is getting bigger. And the reality is that we actually have so much demand for protein. There are opportunities for other proteins to come into the market and provide options for consumers. And so that trend is continuing to be there. One of the things that there's a real question of, I get to work with the Global Roundtable of Sustainable Beef and some of their efforts on the sustainability side. And so from when I put on my CanFax hat and I think about market analyst and global price arbitrage, there's been some frustration about how sticky and the time lag for some of this arbitrage to actually happen in the marketplace. But from the sustainability side, there's also, this desire to have producers rewarded for sustainable practices. And you were just talking with Graham about some of that, and the fact that that's not happening fast enough. And the expectation is, as some of those things come into play in the future, it will provide different market signals for producers to be responding to.
And you talked about stickiness. What do you think is driving that stickiness that seems to be prolonging the, I call it the status quo, but the state of things today?
There are multiple factors in that whole piece, including geopolitics, market access and trade agreements, as well as fluctuating exchange rates.
Right, great. And again, I think that gets into some of the opportunities we'll talk as a group. So thank you, Brenna. I'll bring our last panelist, Ian, to the discussion now. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Vaughn Holder to the discussion. He's the director of the Ruminant Research Group at Alltech. In his role, he leads the company's global nutrition research efforts, studying ruminant species. Holder originally joined Alltech in a postdoctoral role focusing on ruminant protein nutrition. In 2013, he moved to Alltech South Africa to fill the role of National Research and Technical Director. In 2015, he transferred back to Alltech's research headquarters in Nicholasville, Kentucky, to serve as the research project manager for beef. He received a BSc in Animal Sciences and a Master's in Ruminant Nutrition and Microbiology from the University of Pretoria, South Africa. He also has his PhD in Ruminant Nutrition from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Holder, our white paper touches on some of those sobering challenges facing animal agriculture in Canada and around the world as it looks to grow, including disease risk, climate change. Again, we talked about that just with Brenna, these challenges around production systems and the need to boost productivity. How do you see these long-term challenges facing animal agriculture playing out, and what the solutions are to them?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. I think that with those specific ones, I'm actually quite positive for our outcome, because I think these are things that we can tangibly look at and measure, and can implement research funding and science-based policy decision to actually address those things. I think that some of the more threatening things over the future of the next 10 years to come are more abstract things that we're not necessarily that used to dealing with from the scientific community side, and even the policy, perhaps less so the policy decision side. And that's things like misinformation or misinterpretation of information and public opinion. A couple of the topics that have been brought up already this morning around the role of animals in food security, for instance, and probably more appropriately nutrient security, right? I think that a general member of the population would probably assume that animals negatively affect food security, because there's this general consensus that if we just ate the food that they were eating, then we'd be better off. And that sort of comes down to a more fundamental problem with messaging that we have from our community. The folks that are trying to eliminate animal agriculture have a very, very simple message, and that's, cows make methane and methane is bad. And our rebuttal is often a 160-page white paper saying why that's not the case. And that's not something that's easy to deal with from a policy standpoint, because that is not a message that you can have out there. We need to really try and figure out how to focus our messaging on much more simplistic things that can be more translatable to a lot of the members of the public. Because even if you can influence the policymakers, if you can't change the opinion of their bases, you're not going to get anywhere with that. So I think that remains a fundamental challenge for us moving forward as we go through these discussions, is trying to simplify those things. And then there's a few other things that probably would be important as well, things like regulatory barriers. I think regulations are there for very specific reasons, but they can also get in the way of a lot of things, as you've discussed in the white paper as well. And obviously Canada re-looking at some of their regulatory processes for feed additives and technologies going in. Those can be productive and be protective for the industry, but they can also, as you mentioned, get in the way of innovation at times and change the focus of what you might want to be looking at from an R&D and innovation perspective. So those are things that need to be considered moving forward as less tangible threats that we need to think about moving forward.
And so if we have the kind of that innovation ecosystem in place, again, I think you talk about the ability that those solutions will be found to those problems. But again, it came up earlier when you look at feed additives and methane. We've got a product registered in products in other markets around the world, not registered in the Canadian marketplace. When you kind of look at that global landscape that you get to see at Alltech, where does that need to have a functioning better regulatory system, that kind of a more of a welcoming policy environment for the innovations that are going to come fit into it? How important is that? And as you look to develop new solutions, bring them to the marketplace?
It's really important, and you got to think that everything is about, I mean, whether it's from academia or whether it's from private research, where I come from, it's all about prioritizing resources. And when you put roadblocks in the way of those programs going through, you essentially deprioritizing yourself in that process. So I give you an example. We're looking at Canada specifically from a greenhouse gas perspective, but also enhancing productivity in beef cattle. And there's a couple of projects that we've had to deprioritize because we have to look at maintaining the registrations of some of our currently available technologies as the regulatory system changes there. So that's an unintended consequence. Obviously, they're not trying to do that, but it is often those unintended consequences that need to pay careful attention to when we change these procedures, whether we're talking about regulations or we're talking about large-scale philosophical changes to our food systems. It's the unintended consequences which is usually going to make or break whether that's a good idea or not.
And again, it's certainly, I mean, we've got some good examples of that in Canada today. I think if you look at the unintended consequences of some of our sustainability policy, potentially driving land use conversion and adding pressure, that again having, I think it's clearly that's a hard balance. And do you think that we have the right knowledge in place to understand what these unintended consequences are, or is it really a consequence of working in a dynamic, complicated, complex system?
Yes, I think it's a very complicated question to answer, but I think in most cases we are aware of the players in that game, but we do not yet have the tools to measure all those things. And I'll give an example of that one in terms of understanding the effect of cattle on greenhouse gas emissions, right? And we love to hyper focus on emissions because that concept was developed by the fossil fuel industry, who only have emissions and don't have anything else going on. Now we know that there's a lot of other factors in play here in agriculture, right? You've got the emissions coming out of the animals, but you've also got sequestration, but you've also got, talk about byproduct utilization. What happens if you don't utilize those byproducts? And there's a lot of research showing that we would actually increase the emissions if we had to compost or put those byproducts into a landfill. So I think we understand the players, but we have not yet developed all the tools to make those measurements. Sequestration is a big one. How to measure and implement sequestration-based policy changes is going to be a huge one to understand. Because right now we're only talking about emissions. Agriculture contributes X to emissions. That doesn't matter. The net emissions are what matters, because particularly when you're going to be comparing back to fossil fuels.
Great. And so we're going to bring all of the panelists in for a discussion now, and we'll come back to some of these questions. But I wanted to start, Al, with you. I think one of the things that we tried to do in this paper is look at, again, animal agriculture as a whole. We tend to get really focused on commodity value chains. I think that's the way that governments think, that's the way that the industry thinks, but and we can let the little differences maybe get away in understanding what all unites animal agriculture. Al, kind of what are your thoughts after working on this now for for a year, about the similarities between animal agriculture and what those opportunities are to think about those instead of the differences?
Well, I think you stated pretty well, Tyler. As you look at it, it's kind of the same stuff. It maps back to acres of land and conversion, and what we can do to maximize the efficiency of that conversion without weighing in on the function of the animal or the welfare of the animal. And it's in some ways we've got confined housing systems. We've got more kind of outdoor production systems. We've got mixes of the two of them. Sure, those are differences, but really at the end of the day, it's the same thing. A lot of the infrastructure that supports these activities are in common. So you look at where Vaughn's coming from, for example, the feed industry, you don't have feed companies or animal health companies that supply just the beef industry and not others. They're in all of them. And go down the list. Animal health, veterinary equipment, etc. These are all uncommon, and I guess kind of the one single biggest thing I came out of the experience of dealing with all this detail is, really at the end of the day, the big challenges are in common, and certainly whatever details around interest in marketing systems or trade or this or that specific disease, that's actually secondary to what unites animal agriculture in terms of that conversion imperative.
And so, Graham, bring you, we talked in your bio about governance and farm organizations and working together and or good practices, but I'm curious as to your thought around what's needed to better bridge the gap between again the work that the Canadian Cattle Association, Dairy Farmers of Canada, or other supporters on the project do for their own value chains and kind of these opportunities to work on those big challenges that Al talked about. We tend not to, I don't think, have that maybe collaboration built into of the sector, so to speak, very, very well. What are your thoughts on how that plays out and what the opportunities are?
Well, I think there's some good news, Tyler. Certainly in the Canadian perspective, we've got a piece of legislation called Bill C-234 that's finally getting very close to going through the Senate. It's been through the House. You saw almost all of the Canadian organizations, Canadian beef, dairy, chickens, and the list was quite long. They collaborated and put resources and had a consistent message from all of them as they were doing their work on the Hill. I think that's a good news story, and the fact that they were able to pull together on a unique piece of legislation. Now, whether or not that continues, well, the time will tell. But they are presenting their own best interest. So the interests of the dairy producers in Canada is somewhat different than, let's say, the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. The Canadian Pork Council has some different challenges, diseases, and things than our bison producers. So they are advocating in their own self-interest. And if they can find common ground on an issue like species at risk or traceability, then it makes sense for them to put time, effort, money together. But there will also then be from time to time disagreements on one particular policy or one particular piece of legislation that benefits one. Another industry will have challenges with it.
And so, Dr. White, when we think about you mentioned earlier about how we can use new words for old concepts, but food systems has become one of those new words that we talk about, and I think it's an interesting shift in how we tend to think about things, because it should better put kind of that protein space together, or it should think about the different moving parts that were mentioned earlier as well. When you think about kind of your research work at academia, are we doing enough to embrace that thinking? Is that an opportunity for us to think more about, again, the common interests across different particular value chain species, commodities?
Yeah, I think that the movement towards more of a systems lens in the scientific community, policy community, industry is very encouraged and very encouraging. We see things like, the UN food summits, which even do so much as to try and come to the basic question, like what is a food system? How do we define that? What does it mean to be a healthy food system? What does sustainability in those food systems mean? As rudimentary as that exercise is, making sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about is a critical first step. And I think that increasingly we're finding really good convergence at that level of the conversation. I think that that's a place of commonality, and perhaps a place where we can start to work towards simplification of some of these messages.
And that messaging piece again has come up a couple of times, and I think it's interesting. So there's a video that the Canadian Cattle Association's got that you contributed to around upcycling. I think it builds on their work around the Guardians of Grasslands. But part of that I think also has it's all looking for people in academia like you to become more engaged in that discussion. I'm curious around, how do you think about your role as a communicator and doing that work to help people understand these complex systems that we're talking about?
There are academics that are much better communicators and advocates than I am. I think that they would probably be better examples of that opportunity or that role. But certainly in our North American systems, that's one of the elements of our university responsibilities, is to make sure that we're serving our stakeholders. And how we do that is changing constantly. And so we're trying to adapt and trying to learn to be better. Hopefully activities like that can be helpful. And
Brenna, you talked about again your work at CanFax, but also at the Global Roundtable. How do you see that messaging, kind of that work playing out, and that need to try and better focus on those kind of simple communication messages that are there, again, recognizing that this isn't a simple situation, this is a really complex, dynamic, moving marketplace. How do you find that balance to try and communicate about the challenges and opportunities, but do it in a way that's simple?
That's one that trying to boil key points down into something that's memorable is a challenge. And at the Global Roundtable, there's a real focus in everybody making incremental improvements for their stakeholders, but also for the food system as a whole, recognizing that there is a circular economy, and that, as Al mentioned, the need to have a whole suite of metrics, that we don't just focus on one metric, because different production systems around the globe have different strengths and weaknesses on that whole suite of metrics.
Right. And so we've got some questions from our participants, but before we do that, I want to go back to the theme around productivity. And Dr. Holder, maybe I'll start with you, where kind of Al talked about it in his overview, some of the challenges, some of the dynamics, some of the success stories that we've had in improving the productivity of animal agriculture. What do you, when you think about the work that's happening at Alltech and other spaces around the world, what does that future look like for productivity improvements in animal agriculture? Where do you see the greatest opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. I think that our lens has changed a little bit, right? We get back to this idea of systems-based thinking that Dr. White is talking about. I think that our lenses change a little bit towards focusing on the productivity of systems rather than the productivity of individual animals. And it took a little bit of a mind shift for us to make, honestly. And it took this focus on sustainability to make us make that mind shift, that we don't just need to measure everything that comes in the front end of a cow and it comes out the back end of a cow. And the difference between those being what we need to focus on. We're looking at systems now. And so we've really made that shift, and that shift has been forced by our focus on looking at greenhouse gas emissions within a circular system, and why we need to zoom out rather than zoom in like we typically like to do as scientists. So that's our goal. As far as the scope for improvement, it is massive. And it is massive because we know relatively little about this environment of the rumen on a micro level, but also the fact that we have zoomed out means that there are several other opportunities within these systems to either improve productivity or decrease waste within that system. And when we do either of those, or ideally both of those, then all of a sudden you have a very long or a very good runway for improvement of all of these metrics that we're discussing.
Al, what are your thoughts around that focus on productivity improvement, the potential there, and the ecosystem in Canada around trying to deliver productivity improvements? Are we well positioned to do more in this space?
Well, I think so. We can always add to it. I'm just reflecting a little bit on some of the pretty impressive productivity gains, measured with particular measures. Again, feed conversion. litter size in swine, marketable pigs per sow, et cetera. So we have an infrastructure that we can build on in that regard. It has to be nurtured. That capacity has to be maintained and grown. But I'd be pretty optimistic that we can do that. I guess one of the other kind of learning points that really resounded with me as we were going through this work is this problem of how hard can you push the animal in any one dimension before you begin to stray into some other elements that are negative, that influence the animal's function. And I was reading something that Temple Grandin had written, and she was talking about layers that are put into an aviary environment, and they ran into this problem. I believe they break their pelvises, just from the kind of hopping up and down within the aviary environment, and that bone structure, I guess, is just fine as long as they're in a cage. Dig them out of a cage, and well, so kind of, oops, what have we done here? So we have to be able to. I think that's a fine line to walk. We have to respect it. It's very important.
And so Al, picking up on a question that's come from an audience member, you talked about the need for a balanced scorecard for agriculture as one of the recommendations on this, and
Right.
I give others the opportunity to chime in on this. But who on where does that balance score? We have a good understanding of what needs to be on both sides of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a tough question. I'm going to come back to something that Graham mentioned around Bill C-234 and the ability of animal industries to come together. It seems to me that this needs to have the accuracy, the basis, and the integrity to say, well, look, these are the metrics, these are the contents of the balanced scorecard. It's going to take an industry-wide and broad sort of consortium to have that perceived with integrity, and it's going to be difficult to do, but that's one of the challenges that lie ahead of us, and it's a collaborative effort for sure.
And so, Dr. White, when you think about what that scorecard looks like, and again, we've talked about kind of this broad system and bringing different pieces into it. Do you think that there's a good framework for understanding what that balanced scorecard should look like to really kind of understand the different moving pieces? Or is this, one of those areas where we'll see our knowledge, our understanding evolve over the next 5, 10 years as we do pull more different pieces into it?
I think, as a scientist, I have to say that I think knowledge is always evolving. But largely, I think we know the elements that need to be included in these types of exercises. The bigger challenge is having the realistic discussion around our values, because at some point when you have a multi-criteria scorecard, if that's what you want to call it, you have to have a mechanism to explore the equity among those objectives. And the reality of ecosystems is that we don't often find one size meets all goal solutions, which means that there is some degree of compromise between those objectives. Finding out what level of compromise is acceptable and realistic, and to the extent that we don't have to compromise, what those opportunities look like, I think is the bigger area where we need more discussion.
Right. And Brenna, one of the realities that I think that plays out, though, is as much as we need this balanced scorecard, we need a holistic view. Ultimately, it's dollars and cents and bottom lines and market fundamentals that really play out. How do you see that space shifting? Again, you talked about the global roundtables work to try and find better ways to put the value of sustainability in onto those balance sheets. But how do you see that tension between the reality of markets and the need to take a more comprehensive view playing out in the future?
I think this is one that Graham already mentioned, that some of these things are 8 years out. And I think that timeline is one of the challenges of actually having a functioning market that not only has the liquidity needed for some of these things, but also the price levels that allow producers to participate in them, because the reporting burden aspect for producers is real. It takes time, even if you have the records, to fill these things out and to actually participate in these types of markets. These other income sources definitely have potential for the future, but it is several years away.
Right. And do you think that that's something that ends up being, or this idea of kind of the balanced scorecard that kind of to talk about ends up being more of, I don't know, that kind of higher level reality, something that we need to be thinking about on policies, but at the end of the day, farmers are going to continue to be driven by this bottom line markets that probably don't have and may not have for the next couple of years at least, that ability to reflect it into it, or how do you see that balanced scorecard translating into the life of a farmer today as they try and go about their work?
Yeah, just like any niche market or branded program, there's going to be producers who choose to participate in that market and those who choose not to. And it's one that for much of livestock, there is a large base that are going to continue to be driven by market fundamentals of supply and demand for a conventional product.
Yeah. And so one of the other questions that's come in talks about, I think part of that reality of those market fundamentals. So it talks about, again, we've got these, all of the pressures we talked about earlier, all the opportunities that should be driving protection of the grasslands. Again, the Cattle's got a great documentary on Guardians of the Grasslands that people should watch. But at the end of the day, Al touched on the statistics. They show that we are losing those grasslands, that it is moving out of grasslands into largely into row crops. Does that just come down to market fundamentals at the end of the day? Is it driven by profitability in the crop sector and not in animal agriculture? Your thoughts, Brenna, on that, and then Graham?
I think we have quite a bit of experience now with our cost of production network, which includes cow-calf, but also mixed operations. And this is one where whether you're a livestock producer or a crop producer, every operation is unique and different with a different set of profitability. And in doing that work, what we've seen is management is so key. We have profitable cow-calf operations out there that are very competitive with the crop sector. And on the crop side, you have highly profitable and you have the whole spectrum as well, just like we do on the livestock side. And I think it's one of empowering producers of how to apply management in their environment and in their specific context that gets rewarded for them, and that it works in that context.
Oh, it looks like Tyler is frozen there. Al, maybe do you want to take over until he comes back?
Yeah, sure. Graham, do you want to jump in on this? It looks like Tyler's frozen temporarily.
Brandon touched a very good point, and each farm and ranch we have across Canada is unique. Couple of things that come to mind though is that we also have to deal with Dr. Holder said, you've got to deal with other systems. So we have management systems that are on those places, and those management systems tend to value things other than ROI. So whether it's family traditions or whether it's the fact that I like to put my boots and or toes into the grass that I live in. Very good paper surveying some 1,700 ranches across Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri and places. Greenhouse gases ROI are down further down the list, and I would say that paper echoes certainly some of the farms and ranches I've interacted with, is that there are other systems that come into play, other decisions that come into play that maybe not be. So the conversion of that sustainability metric, that balanced scorecard we talked about, is going to be difficult to build, because the balanced scorecard has to make sense to the farming system where it's applied. If I bring in a balanced scorecard for my purposes, at the end of the day, I have a reason to have built it. So whether or not it's the calculator Biological Carbon Canada has put on their website, it has its holes, it has its challenges, and some of the coefficients we keep looking for, and it certainly doesn't have the peace of mind piece that let's say the Guardians of Grassland touched on. Is there some management systems that are dealing with factors other than that straight EDIPA approach that say real business certainly pays attention to.
Great, and thank you, Al and Graham, for taking over whenever my hotel internet gave up on me. But I want to switch gears to another question from the audience around innovation. So again, I think Vaughn, you talked earlier. You seem to be quite confident that we've got kind of the right systems in place, and we'll be able to develop these technologies, bring them to market. But as the question kind of frames it, what we see is governments pulling back R&D investment. We see these regulatory environments that are getting more complicated. Whatever you can maybe push back on your confidence, or will we be able to, or do we have the right systems in place to address these risks and challenges that are there?
Yeah, I think it's there's a reason for my optimism, but I will talk a little bit about some of the challenges as well. I think a huge challenge we had, and we were discussing this the other day, is the pullback in the basic investment in basic sciences. And these basic sciences, I don't know, Robin, if you have seen this in your program, that this basic science is now being fundamentally driven by private companies. And when private companies have to develop this basic research, it's not necessarily being shared as broadly as it would be, and that is stymieing the progress of the industry as a whole. I think traditionally we've had this system where where government funding would fund the basic research in the understanding of these areas, and then corporates would take over and figure out how to make money off of that, right? And that's a fundamental shift in the system to where a lot of that funding, that base funding, has dried up. But I do still think fundamentally that we have a functional research system, in the fact that all of this is driven by potential market forces and profitability. And as such, because of the base demand that we have for animal protein in these systems, that money will end up where it needs to be in order to drive these changes. And there's no shortage of people who want to look at this, and the funding opportunities available to look at these things are escalating all the time with all the pressure on these systems. So I think that time has shown us that agriculture and agricultural scientists have been able to live up to ridiculous challenges in the past. You think about the dramatic improvements in profit in performance of these systems through the wars and those types of things, that was driven by necessity. And I think it will happen again in this case, as long as the market forces point towards that being a goal of the system.
But so on the flip side, though, are these basic fundamental needs for investment and research, and so I know that if you look in Canada, the numbers will show you that Canada is investing less in that basic work. But Robin, Vaughn asked the question: are you seeing that dynamic play out, and what's that landscape look like next door in the United States?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a little bit more subtle in the way that we're seeing shifts. Certainly historically, plant-based agriculture has taken most of the research funding budget from USDA. And places like our National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, were traditionally where we would go for work or funds to support basic work. Increasingly, though, you're seeing those institutions focus more at the interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary intersection of scientific disciplines, and there's not a lot of basic funding that is ready for that intersection, right? A lot of that becomes application testing, etc. So that's a shift that we're seeing, and certainly the availability of research dollars I guess I would add one of the concerns that I have with the way that monies are flowing is that it often seems that we end up a little bit with the cart before the horse. We're funding a lot of adoption programs and a lot of practices, and I'm not sure that they're going to make an impact, and that's a big concern.
And Al, so again, I think that we really see that play out today in Canada, where again a lot of the public dollars really are going to adoption. Again, they are going to adoption instead of R&D and development. And so, Al, how do you see the impact of that playing out, and what's needed to again better frame the innovation space?
I'm going to go back to something that Graham said a few minutes ago. Having to do with the systems on farms and understanding the prospect for adoption and what the realities are. And we have some models of this that we can bring into play, but they're pretty high level, pretty abstract. And I'm more along the lines of you generate the discoveries. You're going to facilitate adoption, of course, but if you're way out front with adoption, ahead of the discoveries, then I'm with Robin, cart before the horse.
And Graham, I think we see this. So again, one of those adoption pieces that the federal government's prioritizing today is around intensive pasture management. I think that's an interesting example where I think the economics of it are pretty solid. That again, a farmer should be able to understand how to involve that, but the federal government's investing its money there. Graham, how do you see that practice or that divide between investing in research versus adoption playing out?
Base research is always needed, and certainly in Canada as a public good, we certainly see it slip. The research around, if you pick on, let's say, Guardians of the Grassland versus other research being done, that research works well in that location. So we've got AMP grazing as an example. And if it's done in our black soils where we've got good soil depth and we've got good rain, then we see positive changes of those particular grazing systems. Where I grew up, far side of Manyberries, and you could short grass and you can watch your dog run away for 5 days. AMP grazing doesn't work with needle and thread, and regardless of how many gigajoule electric fences you can have, the moisture and the soil conditions don't work. And I would suggest there would be a disfer system if you're trying to do that same thing in our red soils of the Maritimes. So it is a challenge to take that best practice, and ultimately it becomes the adoption piece. Yes, research might tell you that there's a change in soil organic matter that you're trying to accomplish. But we've also seen that you can have those systems, and you can have a reduction in our soils because you don't have the moisture or slipping moisture, and you have a change in soils with no management change because we've got more rainfall. So it comes down ultimately to, yes, they're politically acceptable. We like the buzzwords of is relabeling of good agronomic practices. And at the end of the day, that system fits. The movie we saw, I'm here at the Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, the movie we saw last night, the management element and the people element are as important to those shifts as in the mechanics of how do you do AMP grazing versus continuous long-term paddock grazing, or you're dealing with controlled grazing of bale swaths and so on and so forth.
And I do think it's interesting on almost, I think, every project that we do today, this need for better investment in public R&D comes up over and over again. And that is not just an issue in animal agriculture, but across the entire agriculture and food system today, that we really are missing out on that. So I want to pivot to kind of my last question now. So we'll go around the virtual room, and ask everyone the same question. And so let's start with you, Dr. Holder. What do you think the the thing that will have the greatest impact on animal agriculture is going to be over the next 10 years?
I'm going to apologize in advance to Dr. White because I'm going to steal her thunder, but I think that this shift towards systems-based thinking is going to be absolutely critical. I think it changes the way that we look at these systems and the goals that we might have with our research. Rather than looking at all of these items in isolation, which has served us quite well over time, I think the biggest gains to be made in the near future is to understand what the circular, not just economy, but circular flux of nutrients and greenhouse gases looks like when we look at it as a system. And I think that's going to make the biggest change.
Okay. Brenna, over to you. What do you think is going to have the biggest impact?
I would say leadership in terms of how industry responds to some of the challenges facing it, the criticism that comes, but also on the policy side. And that is that, and just building on what was just said about systems, is we can't just look at circular systems within our national borders. We need to make sure that we're also considering the global implications of some of these things. And one of the things that I've worked with a lot is, as we've seen drought reduce production in many of the low emission intensity countries, it's not that we've simply reduced production. That production pops up somewhere else, and frequently it pops up in a country with high emissions intensity. And that means that for the beef industry, at least globally, we're worse off today in 2023 than we were in 2020. And we need to be really thoughtful in our leadership and the decisions that we're making and the incentives that we're creating, that we don't have unintended consequences that actually leave us worse off rather than better off.
Great. Thank you. Dr. White, your thoughts on what will have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think building on both of those, I like to joke that I'm an animal scientist, but all of my problems come down to people. And in reality, I think our greatest opportunity is human resources and finding the strategies to support collaboration, compromise, coordination at the food systems level, which requires leadership and an understanding of the system.
Okay. Graham, over to you.
I think I'm going to take a little higher, and it's that individual farm manager trying to get their head around their EGST risks. These are the external risks, whether it's a change in climate, a change in somebody's government or government trust. You've got the folk out there with the last best tweet that might kill your business, or you're dealing with a technology shift. And so the impact, it'd be hard to describe whether it'd be positive or negative, but they have to be able to digest those external risks and then form a plan to deal with it. I like Brendan's comment about leadership, because even if you see the risk and you're not adapting to, let's say, a 50-year slow change in the water, where I grew up in Minibridge and Milk River, the Milk River is slowly shrinking. And if you haven't adapted your farm and ranch for your water needs, that sits on your plate. AI and its ability to deal with that technology, how is that going to impact your farm or ranch? The social frameworks and how you communicate with your customers beyond just your neighbor who buys the bull or the auction market. You've got to demonstrate that I want to buy your product. All of those things have to come to roost on a yearly basis as you build your management plan.
Great. And Al, last word to you on this. What do you think will have the greatest impact over the next 10 years?
One of the things I didn't get into is, the global state of cereal grain production, utilization, and stocks, and the difficulty building stocks. And frankly, the worry, well, I did make note of Carl Zulof's work on yield growth and its sufficiency to meet the demand for global feed grains in particular. One of the worries I have is that we're just going to run out of feedstock and or run out of land without, straying even worse than we already have in sensitive areas of the globe. And that's where, this work, which I know a little bit about, but not very much, on the synthetic leaf and increasing the efficiency and bandwidth of photosynthesis, to really generate dramatic yield increases that can then feed into animal industries, I think that could be really critical.
Great. Well, and again, so those are good, I think, really good notes to end on. So thank you all to our panelists. Thank you all to our participants for engaging in the discussion today. Again, the recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube channel in the not too distant future. Really want to thank the supporters of the project, the Grand River Ag Society, UFA Cooperative, Dairy Farmers of Canada, the Canadian Cattle Association, and the Livestock Research and Innovation Corporation. We really do appreciate the financial commitments, the personal commitments that they've made to advancing this project along. Please do stay tuned to CAPI's website or Twitter, LinkedIn channels as we share more details about reports around sustainability in the EU and trade and work that we're doing on our other policy files. We are also quite excited about an annual conference that we're hosting on the 31st of January and February 1st, focused on Canadian agri-food in a sustainable world. Please go to our website, www.capi-icpa.ca, to learn more. Thank you all, everyone, for joining the webinar today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next CAPI event.